So journalists, let me put it very simply as I can, journalists have a very difficult time sharing with audiences what's true. Even though what we're supposed to be doing as journalists is sharing information with audiences about what's true so they can figure out what to do next, all right? And yet we don't do that for some very interesting and important reasons, okay? So instead, what journalists in the United States have done is they've come up with some coping strategies. And these are strategies, I'm going to talk about two here, that journalists use. I would argue these are strategies that are essentially surrogates for this validity problem. One is objectivity, and the other is the concept of balance. And I want to talk about each of those briefly for a minute. You've heard these terms before, probably understand them in your own way. I want to reframe them a little bit for you within this validity issue, okay? All right. When it comes to objectivity, the issue is, say journalists, if I can't know what's true, if I can't really know what's true, then what I will do instead is make sure that I accurately capture what somebody says and pop that into a story, okay? Objectivity, in other words, means accurately reflecting the information that you have been given or that you have sought out, all right? Now, that's a good thing, but as I note here, it focuses on a very interesting goodness of fit problem. It's a judgment about the fit between what somebody says and what is in the story that you have just written, okay? And scientists call that accuracy, all right? When scientists are very critical of the accuracy of science stories, it's the primary criticism that they have about public communication of science. And there's a fairly large literature now that looks at what scientists mean when they talk about accuracy. And what they mean is goodness of fit. Okay, it means I said something, and now I'm going to look at the story that you've written and determine if you captured what I said. Okay, now this is not a meaningless problem. I think accuracy is a really important attribute of a narrative. It has to be, in part because you've got to maintain, as a writer, you have to maintain a relationship with that source. So it matters that you get that right. But I'm going to argue here that it has nothing to do with what's true. That whole validity problem, totally ignored by this issue. Okay? Although scientists believe that accuracy is all about validity. It isn't. It's about reliability. Okay? It's about the goodness of fit between what somebody says and what's in the story. What somebody said may have been entirely wrong, but if you get it right in the story, you have written an accurate story, okay? So I would urge us this is a very different way of thinking about accuracy, but I would urge us to care about accuracy, but not to give it the value that scientists place on it, because I don't think it has anything to do with with writers asserting what's true in a story. And that can be a big problem. So objectivity is a way of making sure that a story is accurate, which is to say a reliable fit between assertion and story, but has very little to do with truth claims and validity, okay? The other issue is balance. And that surrogate behavior says, if you don't know what's true, Ms. Journalist, then get a bunch of points of view in the story, Okay? So balance says if you can't say to your reader what's true, then make sure you get a variety of perspectives in that story, so that what you're really saying as a journalist is the truth is in here somewhere. Okay? I am including perspectives that give you a sense of the continuum along which truth lies. Okay? And what journalists will often do is, instead of providing a whole variety of points of view, go to the endpoints. So if you're writing about vaccines and autism, you find a source who is a proponent of that link, and then you go looking for a source who is quite certain that the link does not exist. Okay. Now, there's a certain logic in this, if you think about it, because what a journalist is not saying overtly, but I think implies by this, is that I'm trying to capture the spectrum of opinion here in order to share with you, reader, the argument that, again, the reality is somewhere between these 2 points. Okay. But unfortunately, that's not what audiences get from those stories. There has been a small set of research projects now that explore our reactions to stories that balance. And when I say balance, what usually happens is you give sort of equal dollops of space to the proponent of the vaccine autism link and to the scientist who believes there is no such link. Now again, remember what a journalist is saying is, I can't tell you, audience member, who's telling the truth. I think the truth is somewhere on this continuum. Okay. When you show stories like that to audiences, they have a very different reaction. What they say when they look at those stories is, nobody knows what's true. Very different. Think about it for a minute. We're saying the truth is in there. We just can't point at it. We can't find that point on the continuum and point at it for you. And what audiences are saying, well, this means nobody knows what's true. This is it's a toss-up. And either of these things could be true, equally likely to be true. And that's not what journalists intend to convey. The end result of all of this, this concept of he said, she said stories, we characterize it like that in the United States. Again, there's somebody on this side and somebody on this side. Focus on accuracy, not on whether what's in that story is close to being true or not. Confused audiences and frustrated scientists. And journalists, American journalists, do this knowing full well that this is not a good idea. Let me mention the results of a couple of studies. I didn't do these, but way back when cold fusion was announced, again, this was a case where 2 chemists announced they were going to hold a press conference at the University of Utah in order to announce that they had figured out a way to create fusion processes with cheap equipment at room temperature. People called it sort of tabletop fusion. And I remember talking to some journalists who were going to the press conference and who said to me, "Oh, this is bogus. We've talked, our physicist sources say this is just not real. There is no way this could happen." And then I remember listening to them as they talked, and I said, "But you're going to the press conference." "Oh yeah, we have to cover it. It's news. We have to cover it. It's going to be big news. Everyone else is going to be there. I've got it." This was a science writer for the Los Angeles Times. We're going to write it. and, let the marketplace of ideas sort it out. Okay. So here's a case where, again, very, very common, where the journalist knew this wasn't going to pan out. In other words, had highly credible sources sharing information that this was just really not a story, and it became major news anyway. Okay. Or a second very interesting, and this colleagues at a couple of colleagues studied this particular set of stories. Or another very interesting study was done by a guy named Jim Deering, who looked at what he called scientific outliers. These are issues where balance doesn't seem to make any sense, where there is a maverick point of view and and aside from this guy over here, a consensus. Okay, so Peter Duesberg, his claims that the HIV vaccine does not cause AIDS is a good example. Ibn Browning and his earthquake prediction is as an example. The cold fusion story is an example. And what Jim did is he analyzed media coverage of these kinds of controversies and found, just as you would expect, that stories covered a variety of perspectives and treated these perspectives with respect, thus giving credibility to these different positions. So Peter Duesberg gets as much space in stories as the scientists who believe that, who think he, although he's certainly was a respected scientist for many years, that he's just nuts on this particular controversy.